BBC must be impartial. That's what this is about. And Gary Lineker needs to understand it.
Let's speak to former BBC executive Tim Luckhurst. Morning.
Good morning. I'm now Principal of South College at Durham University, of course. It's fascinating to hear Tim Davie beginning to make the sort of contributions which might lead to a compromise, because what we need in this disgraceful row is a compromise. Both sides need to recognise that they've made mistakes. Both sides need to reach an amicable agreement. Both sides need to act in the interests of the licence payer, the viewers who weren't able to watch Match of the Day or Football Focus or Final Score last night. Tim Davie's absolutely right to want Gary Lineker back behind the camera and presenting these programmes, which are core for the BBC's football-loving audience. He's a very good football presenter, a great football analyst. Gary Lineker's problem is that he's not a great political commentator or historian. And really, Tim Davie's request to him last week, whilst it may have been made in a clumsy way, was a perfectly reasonable request. As a member of the Free Speech Union and a passionate advocate of the individual's right to express opinion, I worked for a long time as a BBC journalist. And the one thing I knew was that I couldn't express views on political controversy while I worked for the BBC.
I guess the difference is he's not a journalist, is he?
Tim Davie, I think, made a very strenuous effort to explain to Gary Lineker that what has changed is the circumstances. The BBC did actually change its contract for non-journalism presenters who had a high profile last year to make it clear that their use of social media had to be treated with great care at the moment. And that's because the BBC is facing unprecedented pressure. There used to be a joke that if the BBC was being attacked by both the major political parties, it was probably doing something right. Well, it may be doing something right, but it's also putting itself in grave jeopardy. There are people in the government who would like to end the licence fee, some who are not fond of this great British national institution, which I think is a great tool of British cultural diplomacy. The BBC is a very valuable national institution. To preserve that institution, Tim Davie has got to achieve the objective of taking the heat out of the argument about the BBC, making people look at it, look at its value, look at what it does. Perhaps, yes, having an intelligent argument about what it should do in future, but above all, understanding that it needs to be preserved. And what he was asking Gary Lineker to do was not to sacrifice his rights as a citizen, but rather to recognise his responsibilities as a BBC employee and not do things which he knows, Tim Davie knows, and Gary Lineker should know too, will cause enormous difficulty.
But Tim, what the question here though is, what is that resolution? Because you've made it clear you don't think Gary Lineker should have tweeted. Gary Lineker's made it very clear he does think he should have done, and he's going to carry on. And in fact, he's not even going to apologise, because if he had have apologised and said, I won't do it again, then the same would have happened with Emily Maitlis. He would have been back on air. But he's clear he's not going to do that. So I'm just wondering what the resolution is. Is it that Gary Lineker walks away, or is it actually that Tim Davie has to soften or clarify the rules for non-news presenters?
I would like to think that a compromise arises when Gary Lineker agrees to be slightly less petulant. After all, he is great, but he's not bigger than the BBC. And when Tim Davie gives him a little bit less rope with which to hang himself. What I mean by that is, I think we should let what Gary Lineker has said be water under the bridge. And Tim Davie is entitled to say, right, thus far and no further, never again, and you're back in the BBC and we're happy. If Gary Lineker is prepared to accept that it's over, that he doesn't apologise perhaps for that tweet, although I think it was deeply foolish, but he's been hammered for that in the public as well as by the BBC. So he will recognise that comparing the comments of a current democratically elected government to the behaviour of the Nazi regime in Germany in the 1930s was not just silly, it was infantile. So if they can make that agreement, Gary doesn't do it again and he comes back, that would be absolutely fine by me. But I don't think anyone should be under any delusion. This has become a row in which politicians on both sides are attacking the BBC. I think that's really, really sad. There used to be a joke when I was there, as I said, that if it was attacked from both sides, it was doing well. On this occasion, it's become a football in the culture war. Keir Starmer's jumping on Gary Lineker's side, despite the fact that last week many Labour MPs actually criticised Gary Lineker for his comments about 1930.
I think it's important, Tim, to make it clear here that he never actually used the word Nazi. He carefully constructed deconstructed that tweet, and he said that the language of this government and their migration policy reflected the language of 1930s Germany. There is a subtle difference there. But it's interesting you
It's
talk
still
about...
completely untrue, Chloe. And
But that's your opinion. Other people would disagree with that.
It's not my opinion. I am a historian of the Second World War. It is a fact to say that the language used by the Germans in the 1930s about the people that they described disgracefully as their racial enemy was infinitely more serious than the language that this government has used in any context, or that any British government has used in the context of immigration.
Okay, the argument, let me just put the counter argument to that, Tim, which people have got in touch with us here at Times Radio to point out, that Jewish people, in fact, recently at a meeting, stood up to the Home Secretary Suella Braverman and said, the language of talking about invading and things like that, it's about the fact that the language and the tone is really offensive and dangerous to many people who have recollections and family connections to that period. Let's not get distracted with the language, because what we want to really talk about here is how the BBC gets itself out of this mess. And one of the problems as well, and we've seen it here at Times Radio over the last few days, is there's lots of people out there who pay their licence fee who go, I don't have a problem with Gary Lineker tweeting about this. He's entitled to his opinion. I don't base my political opinions on what he says, so he can tweet away. He's not a news presenter.
Sorry, this is great, but sorry, I'm not going to play this culture war game. This is not a row about immigration. It's a row about impartiality. And it is those who are trying to characterize it as part of a culture war who are making this into a toxic argument. What Tim Davie asked Gary Lineker to do was to maintain the BBC's reputation for impartiality, to not take a stance on issues which are currently issues of party political controversy. That is a standard requirement on high-profile BBC presenters and staff. It's a legitimate requirement. Indeed, given the Ofcom requirement and the requirement which has endured throughout the BBC's existence that it must be impartial and show no party political bias, it is an entirely legitimate and reasonable requirement, even if, like me, you're a member of the Free Speech Union. So this is about impartiality. It's not about immigration. And those who are trying to capture this and make it into a football in a culture war between supporters of and opponents of the government's immigration policy are playing a very, very foolish game. It's one of the toxic things that happens in our modern environment, that people use issues to advance their views. Tim Davie was defending impartiality. I'm defending impartiality. The BBC must be impartial. That's what this is about. And Gary Lineker needs to understand it.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. That was Professor Tim Luckhurst. He's a former BBC executive. He's now Principal of South College at Durham University.